November 1942, North Africa. A column of American Shermans crawled across the baking flats while German Panzers watched from distant escarpments. By noon, the heat pressed down like a hammer. German crews cracked open engine hatches and cursed the boiling air inside their machines. Yet the Shermans kept moving. Their engines did not falter, their pace did not slacken, and the dust they kicked up rolled behind them like a stubborn banner. Reports filtered back through channels. American tanks seldom stopped for heat. The claim sounded like propaganda until captured crews repeated it with the same weary certainty. They just keep going. Months later, far from the desert, a captured Sherman rumbled into a German testing ground. Engineers gathered around with clipboards and cold confidence. They expected crude shortcuts hidden under fresh paint. They expected to confirm a myth and leave with an easy insult. What they found instead felt like a quiet rebuke. The machine was not elegant. It was not beautiful, but it was consistent. Lines were clean, service points obvious, airflow deliberate rather than delicate. When they pushed it, the temperatures rose predictably and settled again, as if the engine were breathing on purpose. The discovery began as irritation. Why would a tank built in such numbers, with such plain solutions, endure where refined machines stumbled? One mechanic ran a hand along a shroud and frowned. Another traced the path of air from intake to exhaust and nodded without speaking. A third counted the seconds it took oil to cool between runs and wrote the number twice to be sure. A single thought cut through the room. This wasn't luck. It was design. By 1942, the war had turned into a contest of endurance as much as firepower. Tanks were no longer symbols of might alone. They were lifelines for advancing armies. In North Africa, engines fought the sun as fiercely as men fought each other. Steel expanded, oil thinned, and precision turned into fragility. Germany entered the war with mechanical pride. Its panzer divisions rolled forward like an orchestra of steel, tuned to perfection. Each bolt, each weld, each gear was placed with almost artistic obsession. But that perfection came at a cost: sensitivity. A few degrees of heat or a handful of sand could disrupt the harmony. Across the ocean, the United States approached tank design with a different spirit: industrial, pragmatic, and brutally efficient. They had not been building tanks for art. They were building for numbers and survival. Their engineers cared less about elegance and more about what happened when a mechanic with dirty hands tried to fix something in a ditch, in the middle of nowhere. When the M4 Sherman entered the war, critics mocked it. It was taller, less graceful, and armed with a smaller gun than its German rivals. Yet when the campaign stretched into deserts and open plains, the Sherman's simple heart kept beating. Crews noticed that it started easily, cooled quickly, and ran long after others stalled. German field reports from Africa mentioned the same complaint. Engine failures frequent due to overheating. Replacement parts arrived slowly. Mechanics fought with radiators clogged by dust and fans choked by grit. The Panzer III and I-4 were masterpieces of craftsmanship, but their cooling systems were built for Europe. Forests, fields, and temperate air. Under desert skies, they suffocated. Meanwhile, American logistics worked like a living organism. Spare parts came in wooden crates, identical and interchangeable. When a Sherman broke down, it was fixed and running in hours. And when one overheated, a rare occurrence, the issue was almost always external. The design itself was forgiving, tolerant of neglect, and designed to keep the crew alive, not comfortable. The Germans couldn't understand it. They studied temperature reports, airflow diagrams, and fuel ratios. Their engines, they believed, were superior. So why did the Americans endure? In 1943, orders went out for technical teams to inspect captured equipment in detail. The mission was simple: identify weaknesses and exploit them. But as they disassembled a Sherman piece by piece, what they found began to challenge the very philosophy of German engineering. The air intakes were oversized. The fans were crude but strong. The oil circulation paths were almost agricultural in simplicity. Every part looked like it had been designed to be built 1,000,000 times, and fixed in the field with a wrench, not a factory's precision tools. What the Germans saw as inelegance was, in truth, resilience. And behind that resilience lay a mindset. Build for conditions, not for pride. As months passed, reports from the front kept repeating the same sentence in different words. American tanks maintain operation despite high ambient temperatures. Engineers dismissed it as exaggeration, yet the field data refused to vanish. So when the first Sherman arrived at Kummersdorf proving ground near Berlin, the engineers were eager to find its secret flaw. But as each bolt came loose and each part was weighed, they found something that made them uneasy. It was not a flaw they uncovered, it was a philosophy, one that favored balance over brilliance. The realization was slow, like dawn breaking through fog. Somewhere between the hum of test benches and the smell of oil, the truth began to take shape. The Americans had built not a better engine, but a better system. The German engineers at Kummersdorf were not easily impressed. They had handled everything from the roaring Maybach HL-230 engines of the Tigers to the fine-tuned mechanics of the Panthers. Yet the Sherman's power plant, a simple Continental or Ford V8, felt alien in its modesty. It lacked refinement, yet it worked like an old farmer's tractor, uncomplaining, stubborn, predictable. When they ran their first controlled test, the air inside the German test bay shimmered with heat. The Sherman idled, its fan humming at a low pitch. Temperature gauges climbed but never panicked. Then the engineers increased the throttle, running it beyond the point where their own engines usually began to strain. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Oil pressure remained steady. The temperature stabilized again. One of the mechanics, a veteran of earlier trials, muttered something about American luck, but another, older and sharper, shook his head. "Luck doesn't build radiators this way," he said. They tore deeper into the machine. What they found was infuriating. Everything seemed obvious. Too obvious. The radiator was mounted with easy access. The cooling ducts were short, direct, unpretentious. The air didn't twist through complex passages as it did in German designs. It simply moved. No elegance, no unnecessary geometry. And it worked. Across the ocean, that same simplicity was being tested in the most brutal ways. In Sicily, American tank crews drove through ruined villages under punishing heat. They drank warm water, wiped sweat from their eyes, and kept moving. Their tanks did not demand tenderness. They could run half-assembled if they had to. The Shermans became known for starting up again even after catching fire. A macabre compliment, but one grounded in truth. Back in Germany, the engineers compared blueprints. They discovered that their own cooling systems used narrow ducting and precision vents designed for efficiency in controlled environments. The Sherman's ducts, by contrast, looked crude, but allowed enormous airflow. Their fans were larger, slower, and more forgiving when coated with dust. It was as if the Americans had anticipated every failure point born of chaos and heat. Meetings turned into arguments. Some insisted that the Sherman's success was due to excess manufacturing. Build enough, and a few will always run well. Others disagreed, pointing to the repeatability of the results. The data did not lie. Under identical tests, the German engines overheated 3 times faster. Then came the turning point, an inspection of the oil cooling loop. Instead of chasing efficiency through delicate systems, the Sherman used abundance. It pumped more oil, used thicker lines, and gave the heat somewhere to go. German designs, elegant but constrained, had left no room for error. The Americans had built theirs expecting error from the start. This discovery sparked an uncomfortable reflection within the German engineering corps. Their culture prized perfection, tight tolerances, precision craftsmanship, controlled conditions. But the war had left little room for perfection. Tanks were fighting in deserts, swamps, snow, and ruins. Perfection cracked under pressure. Simplicity survived. As these lessons reached higher command, some dismissed them as irrelevant. Others took them seriously, quietly incorporating broader tolerances into later designs like the Panther's cooling revisions. But time was slipping away. Each new tank model took months to refine, and the front lines demanded solutions now. Meanwhile, American factories were churning out thousands of Shermans every month. each one identical enough for parts to be swapped between units from different continents. Their supply chains became the war's circulatory system. When a Sherman overheated, which was rare, another part arrived within days. In contrast, a single damaged radiator in a German tank could immobilize it for weeks. By 1944, captured reports from the Eastern Front began echoing the same complaint German crews had once mocked. Engines fail under sustained heat. On muddy or frozen ground, it was the same story. German tanks excelled in theory and on paper, but the battlefield was not paper. It was unpredictable, filthy, and cruel. The engineers began to realize something painful. Their rivals weren't winning by building better machines. They were winning by understanding the environment, by trusting the field over the factory. And yet the German obsession with superiority ran deep. Some tried to redesign cooling systems in haste, adding extra fans, modifying vents. But the war's tide was already turning. What had started as a technical curiosity became a metaphor for the conflict itself. Complexity collapsing under the weight of simplicity. When the final Kummersdorf report was filed, its conclusion was written in restrained, formal language. But between the lines, the engineers admitted what pride had tried to deny. American armored vehicles demonstrate consistent operation under thermal stress, attributed to design prioritization of airflow and mechanical tolerance rather than refinement. A single sentence, bureaucratic and dry, yet devastating in meaning. The report was sent to Berlin. Some nodded at its logic, others ignored it. But for those who had stood beside that idling Sherman, feeling the steady pulse of an engine that refused to quit, the truth was unforgettable. Spring 1944. In a quiet hangar near Magdeburg, a second Sherman arrived for deeper analysis. This one captured intact from Italy. Its olive paint was scarred by battle, its tracks still carrying dust from the Apennine roads. The German engineers were ready this time, prepared to dissect it not as skeptics, but as students. They began by isolating the powertrain. The 4GAA engine, a massive V8 born from aircraft design, was not complicated, but it was confident. Built from aluminum, not cast iron, it weighed less, ran cooler, and offered room for error. Its fans drew air through large grills cut directly into the hull, and the airflow passed smoothly over wide radiators before venting out the rear. There was no labyrinth of ducts, no hidden chambers, just the shortest path between heat and freedom. One senior engineer named Richter stared at the layout for hours. He had designed portions of the Panther's own cooling assembly and could feel the difference instantly. The Panther was precise but demanding. It needed maintenance crews who obeyed the manual like scripture. The Sherman was forgiving, almost casual. A tank built to be understood by a farmhand or a factory worker with grease under his nails. He traced his finger across the oil lines, following them to the auxiliary cooler placed lower than expected. "Why here?" he murmured. A young assistant offered. "Because gravity helps the circulation?" Richter didn't answer, but he smiled faintly. The simplicity was offensive and brilliant. When they ran the Sherman under full load for hours, the results left no room for pride. The engine temperature rose to a limit, held steady and stayed there. It behaved like a living thing with instincts for survival. Their own designs, complex, layered, over-engineered, looked fragile by comparison. Richter recorded his thoughts privately that night. In his notes, later recovered after the war, he wrote, "The Americans design as though war is chaos. We design as though war is order." That line became prophetic. As 1944 advanced, Germany's tank production slowed under bombing raids. Factories moved underground. Supply chains fractured. Tanks were built in haste, and their precision became their downfall. A single missing fan blade or cracked radiator crippled a machine that cost a fortune to make. Meanwhile, the Allies shipped parts across oceans like clockwork. The more the Germans studied the Sherman, the clearer the lesson became. Reliability was not the opposite of sophistication. It was its truest form. They had been chasing mechanical beauty, but the Americans had chased endurance. One final experiment was conducted that summer. Engineers placed a captured Sherman beside a late-model Panther and ran both engines in identical heat chambers. The Panther reached critical temperature in 51 minutes. The Sherman lasted more than 2 hours without failing. The silence afterward was heavier than any argument. Some officers refused to believe it. They blamed fuel quality, poor testing, anything but the result. Yet the data was undeniable. The American approach, bigger vents, wider tolerances, cheaper materials, faster assembly, had achieved something perfection could not: permanence under pressure. It was a hard truth for men raised on the gospel of precision. Their hands had built the most advanced tanks in the world, yet those tanks were dying young. The Sherman, that so-called Tommy Cooker, outlived them in battle after battle simply because it was engineered to breathe rather than suffocate. As the Allies pushed through France, reports of captured Shermans still running after days of non-stop combat reached the laboratories. For the first time, admiration replaced contempt. Engineers began sketching simplified cooling patterns for post-war designs. They understood now that power meant nothing without endurance. By the time the war turned irrevocably against Germany, the truth had become painfully symbolic. The Panther and Tiger were monuments to genius, but genius trapped inside a fragile shell. The Sherman was ordinary yet unstoppable, and so, when the war finally ended and surviving engineers looked back at the wreckage, they remembered that summer day in the test hall, the one when a foreign tank idled calmly as their own masterpiece overheated beside it. In that moment, the myth of superiority melted away, replaced by an understanding that still shapes engineering philosophy to this day. Simplicity is not weakness. It is wisdom. When the war ended, silence fell across the testing grounds. The engineers who had once lived by the creed of precision now found themselves surrounded by ruins. Factories flattened, blueprints scattered, ideals shattered. Yet among the remnants lay one truth they could not ignore. The Sherman had endured because it was built to survive the world as it was, not as engineers wished it to be. In post-war Germany, as the reconstruction began, some of those same men found work under Allied oversight. They examined new designs from America and Britain, and quietly noticed how familiar they seemed. Wide radiators, short air channels, simpler fans. The lessons learned from the enemy had already become the standard of the future. Richter, the man who had written that haunting note about chaos and order, spent his later years teaching mechanical design. He told his students that perfection was an illusion, that a machine, like a soldier, must endure dirt, failure, and unpredictability. He spoke of the Sherman not with bitterness, but with respect. They designed it to live, he would say, and it did. In the years that followed, American engineering philosophy spread far beyond the battlefield. Automobiles, aircraft, even computers began to follow the same logic. Reliability first, elegance second. The seeds of that thinking had been planted in the heat of war, inside the hull of a tank that refused to stop breathing. The story of the Sherman's endurance is more than mechanical. It's human. It speaks of a mindset unafraid of imperfection, one that trusts adaptability over beauty. German engineers had sought mastery over nature. The Americans had chosen to work with it. And when the world grew harsh, one approach broke, the other bent. Decades later, when surviving Shermans still rumbled to life in parades and museums, their engines carried that quiet legacy. Every hum of their fan belts was a reminder that success in war and in life belongs not to the flawless, but to the functional. And so the day those German engineers discovered why American tanks never overheated became more than a technical revelation. It became a parable about humility and perspective, about how even the greatest minds can be trapped by pride. The war ended. The machines were silenced. But in the stillness that followed, the engineers finally understood. Simplicity endures where brilliance burns out. And in that silence, the metal itself seemed to whisper what every soldier and mechanic had already learned. Survival favors the humble.